long before her name became associated with one of the most extraordinary moments in history. The woman known as Mary Magdalene lived a life that few people could have imagined would one day become part of a story told across the world. Her name suggests that she came from the town of Magdalene, a small fishing village located on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. The region was known for its busy markets, fishing boats, and trade routes that passed through nearby towns. Life there could be difficult, shaped by the pressures of Roman rule and the daily struggles of survival. Yet the most significant part of Mary's early life was not her hometown, but the suffering that marked her existence before she encountered the man who would change everything. According to the Gospel accounts, Mary Magdalene had been deeply troubled by forces she could not control. The scriptures describe that she had been possessed by 7 demons, a condition that brought tremendous suffering and isolation. In the ancient world, people did not understand such afflictions in the ways modern medicine might attempt to explain them. What they saw was a woman tormented by powerful and destructive forces. For Mary, this meant living with pain, fear, and likely rejection from those around her. Communities in that time often struggled to understand such conditions. People afflicted in this way were sometimes avoided, feared, or viewed as spiritually cursed. Life for someone in Mary's position could be incredibly lonely. The suffering was not only internal but social as well, creating barriers that separated her from normal life. Then, at some point during the early years of his ministry, Mary encountered the traveling teacher whose reputation was already spreading across the region. His name was Jesus Christ. Jesus had begun traveling through towns and villages throughout Galilee, teaching about the kingdom of God and performing acts that many believed were miracles. People brought the sick, the blind, and those suffering from various afflictions to him, hoping for healing. Stories spread quickly about the authority he carried in both his words and actions. When Mary Magdalene met Jesus, something extraordinary happened. The Gospel of Luke records that Jesus drove the demons out of her, freeing her from the torment that had controlled her life. In a moment that must have felt like the breaking of chains after years of captivity, Mary experienced complete liberation from the suffering that had defined her existence. For someone who had lived under such darkness, the transformation would have been overwhelming. Imagine the sudden silence where chaos once lived. Imagine waking up one morning free from the forces that had dominated every part of life. The relief, gratitude, and wonder Mary must have felt in that moment likely reshaped the direction of her entire future. From that point forward, Mary Magdalene became one of the followers of Jesus. She was not alone in this decision. The Gospels mention that several women accompanied Jesus and his disciples as they traveled through the region. Among them were women who had also experienced healing or transformation through Jesus' ministry. These women supported the group in various ways, sometimes even helping provide for their needs during their journeys. In the cultural context of the ancient world, this detail is remarkable. Religious teachers of the time often surrounded themselves primarily with male students. Yet Jesus welcomed women among those who traveled with him and listened to his teachings. Mary Magdalene became one of the most devoted among them. As Jesus continued his ministry, Mary witnessed events that few people could have imagined. She heard teachings about forgiveness, mercy, and the coming kingdom of God. She watched crowds gather around Jesus wherever he went, drawn by his words and the hope they inspired. She also saw the miracles that strengthened the faith of many who followed him. The sick were healed, the broken were restored. People who had been rejected by society found acceptance and compassion in his presence. The message Jesus carried was not only about spiritual truth, but about transformation in the lives of those who listened. Mary Magdalene's loyalty to Jesus grew deeper with every passing day. The teacher who had freed her from darkness was now leading a movement that seemed to challenge the very structures of society. His teachings spoke about humility rather than power, compassion rather than judgment, and faith rather than fear. But as the movement grew, so did the tension surrounding it. Not everyone welcomed the influence Jesus was gaining among the people. Religious leaders in Jerusalem began to view him with increasing suspicion. His criticism of hypocrisy and corruption within the religious system made powerful enemies. Each time he spoke publicly in the temple courts, the tension between him and the authorities grew stronger. Mary Magdalene witnessed these developments alongside the other followers. She saw both the admiration of the crowds and the anger of those who felt threatened by Jesus' message. The journey that had begun with healing and hope was slowly moving towards something far more dangerous. Yet through all of it, Mary remained close to Jesus. Unlike many who followed him only for a short time, she continued walking alongside the group as they traveled from town to town. Her loyalty was rooted in the transformation she had experienced personally. She knew what her life had been before she encountered him, and she knew who had changed it. As time passed, Jesus began preparing his followers for events they did not fully understand. He spoke about suffering, rejection, and even death. These words confused the disciples who expected a triumphant future for their teacher. But Jesus seemed to know that the path ahead would lead toward confrontation. Eventually, that path would lead them all to Jerusalem, the city where the temple stood, the city where powerful religious authorities held influence, the city where Roman power was enforced by governors like Pontius Pilate. Mary Magdalene could not have known that the journey toward that city would place her at the center of one of the most important events in history. But soon she would witness moments that would forever connect her name with the story of the cross and the miracle that followed. As the ministry of Jesus Christ continued to spread across Galilee and beyond, the number of people who came to hear him grew larger with each passing town. Villagers left their homes, fishermen abandoned their nets for the day, and travelers paused along dusty roads just to hear the words of the teacher whose message carried an authority unlike anything they had heard before. Among those who followed him faithfully through these journeys was Mary Magdalene, a woman whose life had already been transformed by his power and compassion. For Mary, each day traveling with Jesus must have felt like stepping deeper into a new world. The suffering that had once defined her life had been replaced by purpose. Instead of isolation, she now walked alongside a community of followers who believed they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold before their eyes. The group that traveled with Jesus was not large in number, but it was diverse. Fishermen from the Sea of Galilee walked beside tax collectors who had once served the Roman administration. Ordinary men and women from different towns and backgrounds found themselves united by their belief in the teacher from Nazareth. Mary Magdalene stood among them not merely as an observer, but as one who had experienced the power of Jesus' ministry personally. Her gratitude and loyalty were rooted in the memory of the day she had been freed from the torment that once controlled her life. Wherever Jesus went, crowds gathered. Sometimes he spoke from hillsides overlooking the sea. Other times he taught inside synagogues or in open marketplaces, where traders and travelers could hear his voice above the noise of daily life. His teachings were often delivered through parables, simple stories that carried deeper meanings about faith, humility, and the nature of God's kingdom. Mary listened carefully to these teachings. She heard Jesus speak about loving enemies, forgiving those who had done wrong, and showing compassion to the poor and forgotten. These ideas challenged many of the assumptions people had about power and righteousness. Instead of praising the wealthy or the powerful, Jesus often lifted up the humble and the broken. For someone like Mary Magdalene, who had once lived on the margins of society, these teachings carried profound significance. She understood what it meant to feel rejected and powerless. The message Jesus preached spoke directly to people who had experienced suffering and needed hope. But it was not only his teachings that drew attention. Miracles continued to accompany his ministry, strengthening the belief among many that God was working through him in extraordinary ways. Mary witnessed these events with her own eyes. She saw the blind receive their sight and the sick rise from their beds healed. She watched crowds fall silent as Jesus spoke with authority over storms and sickness alike. Each miracle seemed to deepen the conviction among his followers that they were witnessing something far greater than the ministry of an ordinary teacher. Yet, while admiration grew among the people, opposition was also building. Religious leaders in the region began questioning Jesus' authority and the claims surrounding him. They watched carefully as his popularity increased, concerned that his influence might challenge the structures they had spent years maintaining. Some accused him of breaking religious laws. Others argued that his teachings threatened the established order of the temple system. Mary Magdalene and the other followers would have sensed this growing tension whenever Jesus entered certain towns or spoke openly in public places. Conversations among the religious leaders often carried a tone of suspicion and hostility toward the movement forming around him. Despite these dangers, Jesus continued traveling from place to place. Eventually, his journey began leading toward the city that stood at the center of Jewish religious life, Jerusalem. For generations, Jerusalem had been the heart of worship for the people of Israel. The great temple stood there, drawing pilgrims from distant regions who came to celebrate sacred festivals and offer sacrifices according to their traditions. One of the most significant of these festivals was Passover. Every year, thousands of people traveled to Jerusalem to remember the ancient story of deliverance when God had freed their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. The city became crowded with pilgrims, traders, and visitors from across the region. As the Passover season approached during the final year of Jesus' ministry, he made the decision to travel to Jerusalem with his followers. Mary Magdalene was among those who made the journey. The road toward the city was filled with anticipation. Many among the followers believed that Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem might mark the beginning of something dramatic, perhaps even the moment when he would reveal himself as the long-awaited Messiah who would restore the kingdom of Israel. When they finally reached the outskirts of the city, an event occurred that seemed to confirm those hopes. As Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey, crowds gathered along the road to welcome him. People spread their cloaks on the ground and waved palm branches as he passed by. They shouted words of praise and celebration, declaring him the Son of David and the King who came in the name of the Lord. Mary Magdalene would have seen the excitement and energy in that crowd. For a moment it must have felt as if everything was moving toward triumph. But beneath the celebration, tension was already rising. The religious leaders in Jerusalem were watching closely. They saw the crowds praising Jesus as a king, and they feared what such declarations might mean in a city already filled with Roman soldiers ready to suppress rebellion. The temple authorities began discussing how to deal with this growing movement. Meanwhile, Jesus continued teaching within the temple courts during the days that followed his arrival. His words became even more direct as he challenged corruption and hypocrisy among certain leaders. These confrontations made his enemies even more determined to stop him. Mary Magdalene remained close during these events, witnessing both the admiration of the crowds and the hostility of those who opposed him. None of the followers fully understood how quickly the situation was about to change. Within a matter of days, the celebration that greeted Jesus' arrival would give way to betrayal, arrest, and a trial that would place his fate in the hands of a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. And Mary Magdalene would soon find herself standing at the edge of the darkest moment in the story of the man who had once freed her from darkness. The days that followed the arrival of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem were filled with an intensity that few among his followers had ever experienced before. The city itself seemed alive with anticipation. Pilgrims had come from distant towns and villages to celebrate the Passover festival, filling the narrow streets with voices, prayers, and the constant movement of crowds traveling to and from the great temple. Among those moving through the city during those days was Mary Magdalene, who had followed Jesus faithfully throughout his ministry. She had witnessed miracles, heard his teachings, and watched the crowds respond with awe and hope. Yet even she could sense that something was changing. The tension between Jesus and the religious leaders had grown impossible to ignore. Each time Jesus spoke publicly in the temple courts, the atmosphere became more charged. His words challenged the hypocrisy and corruption he saw within the religious system. He spoke boldly about justice, faithfulness, and the true purpose of worship. For many among the ordinary people, these teachings felt like a breath of truth in a world weighed down by rigid traditions and powerful authorities. But for the leaders who controlled the temple system, his words sounded like a threat. They feared the growing influence he had over the people. They feared that the crowds who followed him might spark unrest that could draw the attention of Rome. And most of all, they feared losing the power they had carefully maintained for years. Conversations among those leaders began turning toward a single question. How could they stop him? Mary Magdalene would not have been present in the secret meetings where these plans were discussed. But the consequences of those discussions were soon felt by everyone around Jesus. The leaders knew they could not arrest him openly while the crowd supported him, so they searched for a way to act quietly. Eventually, they found someone willing to help them. One of Jesus' own disciples, Judas Iscariot, agreed to reveal where Jesus could be found away from the crowds. In exchange for a small payment of silver coins, he led the temple authorities to the place where Jesus and his followers had gathered during the night. The arrest happened in the darkness. Roman soldiers and temple guards arrived suddenly, carrying torches that cut through the night air as they surrounded the small group. The followers who had spent years walking beside Jesus were caught off guard by this sudden confrontation. Some tried to resist. Others fled in fear as the soldiers seized Jesus and bound him for questioning. Mary Magdalene, like the other followers, could only watch as the teacher who had changed so many lives was taken away. Under guard, the man who had spoken with authority and healed the suffering was now treated like a criminal. From that moment forward, events began moving rapidly. Jesus was taken first to the religious authorities for questioning. The leaders who had been searching for a way to condemn him now gathered to hear accusations and testimony against him. Some witnesses spoke against him, claiming he had threatened the temple or spoken words that could be interpreted as blasphemy. Yet their accusations were often inconsistent. Still, the leaders were determined to reach a conclusion. According to their interpretation of the law, they declared that Jesus deserved death. But there was a problem. Under Roman rule, the religious leaders did not have the authority to carry out executions. Only the Roman governor could approve a death sentence. That meant the case would now be brought before the man responsible for maintaining order in Judea, Pontius Pilate. As dawn approached, Jesus was taken to Pilate's headquarters. Crowds had already begun gathering outside, drawn by rumors spreading through the city. Word traveled quickly. Whenever something dramatic unfolded during the Passover season, especially when it involved a figure as well known as Jesus, Mary Magdalene was among those who waited anxiously as the trial unfolded. She had seen Jesus speak with authority before crowds of thousands. She had watched him challenge powerful leaders without fear. But now he stood alone before the Roman governor, accused by those who wanted him removed. Pilate questioned Jesus about the accusations. The leaders claimed that Jesus had declared himself a king, a charge that carried serious implications under Roman law. Any claim to kingship could be interpreted as rebellion against the authority of Rome. Yet during the questioning, Pilate seemed uncertain about the charges. He could see that the situation was complicated by religious tensions, rather than clear political rebellion. According to the Gospel accounts, Pilate even stated that he found no basis for a death sentence. But the crowd outside continued growing louder. The religious leaders urged them to demand execution. Their voices echoed through the courtyard, calling for crucifixion, the brutal Roman punishment reserved for criminals and rebels. Pilate found himself facing a difficult choice. If he released Jesus, he risked angering the leaders and the crowd, potentially creating unrest during one of the most sensitive times of the year in Jerusalem. But if he condemned Jesus, he would be authorizing the death of a man he believed might be innocent. For Mary Magdalene and the other followers watching from a distance, the situation must have felt unbearable. The teacher who had healed the sick and restored hope to so many lives was now standing before a Roman court while the crowd demanded his death. Soon the decision would be made, and the consequences of that decision would lead Mary Magdalene to a place of grief and sorrow she could never have imagined when she first began following Jesus across the hills of Galilee. As the morning advanced and the tension inside the Roman court reached its peak, the fate of Jesus Christ was placed in the hands of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. The voices of the crowd echoed through the stone courtyard as accusations and demands collided in a chaotic storm of anger and fear. For the followers of Jesus watching from a distance, the moment felt like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Among them was Mary Magdalene, who had once experienced the life-changing power of the man now standing before Roman authority as a prisoner. Pilate questioned Jesus carefully. The charge brought before him was serious. The religious leaders had accused Jesus of claiming to be a king, a title that would imply rebellion against the authority of Rome. In a province already filled with tension and political instability, any hint of rebellion was treated as a serious threat. Yet, as Pilate examined the situation, he seemed unconvinced by the accusations. The governor could see that the conflict surrounding Jesus was deeply tied to religious disputes among the local leaders. The man standing before him did not appear to be the type of revolutionary leader Rome typically executed. There were no armed followers surrounding him, no plans for rebellion, no signs of a military uprising. Despite this, the pressure from the crowd continued to grow. The chief priests and influential leaders urged the people to demand the harshest punishment available under Roman law. Their voices stirred the crowd into a unified cry that echoed again and again through the courtyard. "Crucify him." Pilate attempted several times to avoid delivering such a sentence. According to the Gospel accounts, he even offered the crowd a choice. During the Passover festival, it had become a custom for the governor to release one prisoner as a gesture of goodwill to the people. Pilate placed two men before the crowd. One was Jesus. The other was a prisoner named Barabbas, a man known for violence and rebellion. Pilate expected the crowd to choose Jesus, but the situation had already been shaped by the influence of the religious leaders. They encouraged the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas instead. When Pilate asked what should be done with Jesus, the response thundered across the courtyard, "Crucify him." For Mary Magdalene and the other followers watching from afar, the sound must have been devastating. The teacher who had brought healing and hope to countless people was now being rejected by the very crowd that had once welcomed him into the city. Pilate hesitated. The governor even declared that he found no guilt in Jesus that deserved death. Yet the shouting from the crowd continued, growing louder and more insistent with every passing moment. At that point, Pilate made a symbolic gesture that would be remembered for centuries. He called for water and washed his hands before the people, declaring that he was innocent of the blood of this man. The responsibility, he claimed, belonged to those demanding the execution. But despite this gesture, the authority to make the final decision still rested with him. And eventually, Pilate gave the order. Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion. Roman soldiers immediately took control of the situation. The brutal process of execution began with public humiliation. Jesus was mocked, beaten, and forced to carry the heavy crossbeam that would soon become the instrument of his death. Mary Magdalene remained among those who followed at a distance. The streets of Jerusalem were crowded as the soldiers led Jesus through the city toward the place of execution outside the walls. The hill was known as Golgotha, often called the place of the skull. Roman crucifixions were designed to be public spectacles meant to discourage rebellion. Victims were displayed where travelers and citizens could see the consequences of defying Roman authority. When Jesus reached the hill, the soldiers carried out the sentence. They nailed him to the cross and raised it upright so that the crowd could see him hanging between heaven and earth. Above his head they placed a sign describing the accusation against him: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. For the followers who remained near the cross, the scene was heartbreaking. Many of the disciples had fled during the arrest, overwhelmed by fear, but a small group remained, unwilling to abandon the man who had changed their lives. Among them stood Mary Magdalene. She watched as the hours passed and the suffering continued. The man who had once freed her from darkness now endured unimaginable pain, while the world around him seemed to collapse into confusion and sorrow. Eventually, the moment came when Jesus breathed his last breath. The sky darkened and a heavy silence fell over the hill. The execution that the crowd had demanded was now complete. For Mary Magdalene and the other followers, the grief was overwhelming. The teacher they had trusted, the man they believed carried the power of God, was gone. His body was removed from the cross and placed in a nearby tomb before the arrival of the Sabbath, when Jewish law required work to cease. As evening approached, the stone sealing the tomb was rolled into place. The story that had begun with miracles, hope, and transformation now appeared to end in tragedy. But what Mary Magdalene did not yet know was that the darkest moment of the story was only the beginning of something that would soon astonish the world. Within a few days, she would witness an event that would forever connect her name with the greatest miracle ever recorded. The day after the crucifixion passed slowly and quietly for the followers of Jesus Christ. Jerusalem, which had been filled with shouting crowds and public spectacle only hours earlier, now seemed strangely calm. The Sabbath had begun, and according to Jewish law, people rested from their work and remained in their homes. For those who had followed Jesus, however, rest was impossible. Among them was Mary Magdalene, the woman whose life had been transformed years earlier when Jesus freed her from the darkness that once controlled her existence. She had walked with him through towns and villages, listened to his teachings, and witnessed miracles that had convinced many he carried the authority of God. But now the teacher who had brought hope to so many lay in a sealed tomb outside the city walls. The grief Mary must have felt during those hours is difficult to fully imagine. The man who had restored her life had died in the most brutal way imaginable. The dreams that had grown among his followers the belief that he might bring renewal and deliverance seemed to have collapsed beneath the weight of Roman power. The tomb where Jesus had been laid belonged to a wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea. who had requested the body after the crucifixion. Before the Sabbath began, Jesus had been wrapped in linen cloth and placed inside the rock-cut burial chamber. A large stone had been rolled across the entrance to seal it. Mary Magdalene had watched where the body was laid. That detail would soon become important. When the Sabbath finally ended and the first light of the new week approached, Mary and several other women prepared to return to the tomb. Their intention was simple and deeply personal. They wanted to complete the burial preparations by anointing the body with spices, a traditional act of respect and care for the dead. In the early hours of the morning, while the sky was still dim with the first hints of dawn, Mary Magdalene made her way toward the tomb. The streets of Jerusalem were quiet as she walked. Her thoughts were likely filled with sorrow and reflection. Only days earlier, she had watched Jesus welcomed into the city by cheering crowds. She had heard people proclaim him as the one sent by God. Now she was walking toward a grave. When she arrived at the burial site, something immediately felt wrong. The stone that had sealed the entrance was no longer in place. For a moment, confusion and fear must have surged through her mind. Tombs were not meant to be opened like this, especially after being sealed with such care. The most logical explanation seemed terrifying. Someone had taken the body. Mary rushed back to tell the other followers what she had seen. Among those she found were two of the disciples who had been closest to Jesus. When they heard her report, they ran toward the tomb to see for themselves. When they arrived, they found the tomb exactly as Mary had described. The stone had been rolled away. Inside the burial chamber, the linen cloths that had wrapped the body remained, lying neatly where they had been placed. But the body itself was gone. The disciples examined the scene, trying to understand what had happened. After some time, they left the area, still struggling to make sense of the mystery. Mary Magdalene, however, remained near the tomb. Her grief had not yet lifted, and the unanswered questions only deepened her sorrow. Standing outside the burial place, she began to weep. The man who had changed her life seemed to have disappeared even from death. As she leaned forward to look once more inside the tomb, she saw something unexpected. Two figures were sitting where the body of Jesus had once been placed. The Gospel accounts describe them as angels, messengers whose presence signaled that something extraordinary had occurred. They asked Mary a simple question. "Why are you weeping?" She answered through her tears, explaining that someone had taken the body of her Lord, and she did not know where it had been placed. After saying this, she turned away from the tomb, and that is when she saw someone standing nearby. At first, through her grief and confusion, she did not recognize who it was. The man spoke to her gently and asked the same question. "Why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Thinking he might be the gardener responsible for the area, Mary asked if he had moved the body and begged him to tell her where it had been taken. Then the man spoke her name, Mary. In that single word, something changed. The voice was familiar. The presence was unmistakable. Standing before her was the man she believed she had lost forever. It was Jesus Christ. The resurrection had happened. The teacher who had been crucified and buried was alive. Mary Magdalene became the first person recorded in the Gospels to witness the risen Christ. The sorrow that had filled her heart only moments earlier was replaced by astonishment and overwhelming joy. Jesus gave her a message to deliver to the others. She was to go and tell his followers that he had risen from the dead. Mary immediately obeyed. She returned to the disciples with the incredible news that she had seen the Lord. In that moment, the woman who had once lived in darkness and suffering became the first messenger of the resurrection. Her story, which had begun with healing and restoration, now reached its most extraordinary chapter. For centuries, the name of Mary Magdalene would remain connected to that morning outside the tomb. While others had fled in fear during the darkest hours, she had remained faithful through grief and uncertainty. And because of that faithfulness, she became the first witness to the event that would change the course of history. The resurrection of Jesus would soon be proclaimed throughout Jerusalem and far beyond. The movement that many believed had ended at the cross would instead spread across nations and generations. And forever woven into that story would be the name of the woman who stood outside the empty tomb. At dawn, Mary Magdalene, the woman who witnessed the resurrection,